The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, emerged from talks with European leaders in Paris tonight, calling for the US to provide a backstop to prevent Russia invading Ukraine again. He also called Ukraine a generational challenge and said allies in Europe would have to step up while pledging UK troops as potential peacekeepers. But moves were also getting underway elsewhere to try to end the war in Ukraine. At the same time as the Paris talks, senior US and Russian officials began arriving for a separate gathering in Saudi Arabia, seemingly to pave the way for a Trump-Putin meeting. And with Ukraine not invited to the Saudi talks, it's feared tonight that Britain, Europe and even President Zelensky are in danger of being sidelined.
Europe may no longer boast the fighting forces it once had, but it's still pretty good at the ceremonial stuff. This may have been a last-minute summons to Paris, but the Elysee Palace was ready. Keir Starmer walked around from the British embassy next door, an offer of British troops for a Ukraine peacekeeping force in his pocket. A strategic turning point for the continent, he calls this. Whether that's remotely practical if the Americans are not participating or at least guaranteeing such a force is doubtful. And certainly by the time Germany's Olaf Scholz arrived, his officials were pouring cold water on the idea. Such are the problems President Macron will have producing a united European position. He spoke to President Trump before the meeting started. Now he needs the continent to respond with one voice. Europe has armed, supported and funded Ukraine since the very beginning of the war, and yet its leaders find themselves in there trying to find a way to stay relevant to the ending of this conflict. That's how much Trump has turned the normal rules of diplomacy on their head. The talks went on an hour and a half longer than scheduled, with growing acceptance of how much more Europe needs to do. But there's still a reliance on a US commitment that under Trump may just not be there.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. In this moment, we have to recognise the new era that we are in, not cling hopelessly to the comforts of the past. It's time for us to take responsibility for our security, for our continent.
Nothing could make that clearer than the way diplomacy is moving on without Europe. As the leaders spoke in Paris, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Saudi Arabia ready for face-to-face talks with the Russians tomorrow. The man he'll meet, Putin's foreign minister, delighting in the fact that he has a seat at the table and Europe doesn't. The European philosophy hasn't gone anywhere, he said, so I don't know what they should do at the negotiating table. Why should we invite them at all? Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky is also in the Middle East visiting the United Arab Emirates. But is he invited to the Saudi talks tomorrow? No. Any negotiations about Ukraine, without Ukraine, will have no result, he promised. The leaders headed back to their capitals this evening, many without saying anything. Even President Macron, normally so keen to hail progress and his role in achieving it, is keeping silent for now. It doesn't suggest that this has been the breakthrough moment he may have been hoping for.
So, James, just what was achieved there in Paris today?
Well, there does seem to have been an acceptance on the issue of having to spend more on defence and having to look after much more of Europe's own defence. And that was clear from what both Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said, and Sir Keir Starmer said this evening. But in terms of any sort of understanding that with Trump we may be getting the worst case scenario as far as Europe is concerned, well, they seem to be a way off that yet. There still seems to be a belief that they can deal with Trump. President Macron always believes he can charm people and certainly thinks he can charm Trump. Sir Keir Starmer has been talking about himself as the bridge between Europe and Washington, playing on the history of the special relationship. We'll see if that works when he goes to Washington next week. Italy's Giorgia Meloni, the leader of a far-right party, exactly the sort of person who Trump thinks ought to be leading countries in Europe. She didn't even want this meeting to happen and rather sulkily turned up an hour late for it. She thinks that she can be the Trump whisperer, if you like. So we'll have to see where all that goes. But even given the events of last week and the shock of last week to the European system, there still doesn't seem to be an acceptance here that one day maybe Europe is going to have to face a resurgent Russia without those US security guarantees that's always been there.
James, in Paris, many thanks indeed. Well, having British boots on the ground as part of any peacekeeping force in Ukraine would be a mission fraught with operational difficulty. And with UK defence spending under pressure, there are also the potentially thorny questions of resources and cost.
Since the start of this conflict, the UK has been one of Ukraine's closest and strongest allies, more often than not, putting our money where our mouth is. The UK has trained Ukrainian soldiers previously, and Keir Starmer says he's willing to commit British troops to potential peacekeeping, but there are questions about how feasible that is.
It is not going to be very easy to do it. First place, you've got all the constraints on the British side. We don't have many troops, and even promising more spending isn't going to answer that immediate question, because it takes some years to get them, recruit them, train them, and so on.
The UK armed forces are more than 5,000 personnel below their target size at the moment, and these proposals will cost money. At the moment, the UK currently spends 2.3% of GDP on defence. Starmer has pledged to increase this to 2.5%, but it's not clear when that will happen. This puts the UK in a pretty good position compared to our NATO allies, who have to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defence. This was agreed in 2014. Since then, all European nations have increased their budgets, and the countries who spend more than the UK share a border with Russia. In real terms, the UK is spending roughly £54 billion on defence. Germany spends a bit more, Italy a little bit less. But everyone is dwarfed by the US, who are spending £768 billion a year. That's why they want other countries to do more. With the conflict ongoing, all of this has real implications for the people of Ukraine. The Prime Minister is expected to visit Donald Trump next week, and this is likely to come up. An increase in defence spending will win favour with the US president, but with domestic pressures on public services, there are reports the Treasury might not be so keen to sign it off. Experts, however, warn they might have no choice.
It's clear the UK has to spend more on defence. The world has changed. We can't rely on the Americans to the extent we could in the past. And I would say that 2.5% isn't enough. But honestly, if you look at the state of the world and the state of the armed forces, I think it's going to need more than that.
Ahead of these crucial talks, Keir Starmer has issued a signal of intent. The UK remains willing to support Ukraine and secure its safety if required. It will be well received in Kyiv, but is likely to be costly. Shihab Khan, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, Emma's here to give her analysis. And Emma, the UK's commitment to Ukraine doesn't appear to be in doubt. But with President Zelensky's absent from the talks, can there really be any kind of lasting peace?
Well, that's the big issue. I mean, you say there that the commitment isn't in doubt, but what it can deliver is a different thing. And in terms of lasting peace, President Zelensky has been very clear that if he is not in the room, if the Ukrainians are not at the table, they will not recognise the outcome of those talks. And I think that's because they know that there is nobody in there really batting for them. They don't totally trust the Americans, even though they won't go that far as to say it. But they are very fearful now about where this goes. And this evening, President Zelensky has just landed in Turkey. He's going to have conversations with President Erdogan. He's acted as some kind of bridge between Russia and Ukraine in the past. And I think there is a hope on the part of the Ukrainians that they can speak to him, and possibly that will be a voice that is a greater champion for the Ukrainians than they are seeing necessarily in the Americans. And I think in terms of the European position, yes, there has been a lot of talk today about what they want to do going forward, how they can support Ukraine. And this evening, we know that President Macron has spoken with President Zelensky, and they've discussed the need for long-term security guarantees. But the big issue is what they can actually offer. How does Europe offer sustainable security guarantees in the absence of the United States. And if the United States isn't there to offer them, really what can the peace look like? And that's Zelensky's great concern. If he doesn't get robust security guarantees, he has a fear, and probably rightly, that Russia will come back at some point in the future and take more of Ukraine, and there will be another war, and potentially a more ferocious one.